and I'm extremely happy to see everyone here on Global Youth Climate Action Day with a number of young elected officials. I am almost, I believe, still in that category but some of us have been watching and being inspired by the young elected officials coming up the ranks. Elected officials to protect America brings together elected officials who are passionate about protecting our environment and fighting climate change. We educate, we train, and we connect elected officials on these issues. So together as their unified voices, we can put policies, share ideas, and let the community, the public, and the media know why it is so important to be addressing the issue of climate change now, particularly for our future. I mean, the United Nations reported the world suffered about 75% more extreme weather disasters in the last 20 years than the previous 20 years. Additionally, a report came out yesterday from the World Meteorological Organization that showed the last decade was the warmest on record. In the Arctic, even with 100.4 degrees weather, and then in Death Valley, California, 129.92 degrees. This is happening right now. And our future that is being dominated by the pandemic right now, unfortunately, is going to become more common if we don't address climate change. The spread of infectious diseases is more likely, with already half of the world's hospital beds came from infectious diseases that were waterborne before COVID. And the destruction of habitat, our connection and disturbing that habitat where animals are living increases the transmission factors. And of course, the world's deadliest animal, the mosquito, is projected to cover the entire world if we don't address climate change. And these are all issues right now, but will get even more dire, more drastic if we don't address it for the future. And that is one of the reasons EOPA is putting on this press conference to really highlight the issue and need to act immediately and swiftly. But there's tremendous hope with elected officials across America working on these issues tirelessly and dedicated to it. And with that, I would love to introduce our first speaker, Ithaca, New York Mayor Svante Myrick. He's been dedicated to this issue between YEO and seeing New York pass one of the best climate bills possible.
Yes, thank you very much. And I really appreciate it. Yes, I've been mayor of the city of Ithaca. This is the end of my 9th year as mayor, my 13th year in elected office. I was first elected to the city council when I was 20 years old and a junior at Cornell. I found the mentorship and guidance of people like Dominic Frangillo, a legislator in the county, so incredibly important. You know, he introduced me to the Young Elected Officials Network, a network it's now my pleasure to run of 1,300 progressive elected officials under the age of 35, who are right now all over the country at school board, municipal, state, and federal levels, fighting for justice on a whole range of issues. But the one thing you'll find in our network, right, whether it's a school board member in Kansas or a city councilman in New York City or a United States senator in Arizona, what you find is an understanding that climate change is the largest issue of our times. And this is not unusual. You know, I often find people who are surprised to learn that there are so many young elected officials. But from the very inception of our country to now, change and progress has been pushed by a coalition of, I say a coalition loosely, right? Often it is young activists pushing, encouraging, demanding young elected officials to do better, to reach further, to aim higher. And on climate, we see exactly that dynamic playing out. Activists in the streets, online, and in meeting rooms are pushing elected officials, and the elected officials who have been most responsive are those who recognize, look, the youngest members of my network are 18 years old right now. Right? That means in 2050, they'll only be 48. Right? In the year 2100, they will still be around. Some of them will still be in office. So the dangerous world that we're building by not addressing climate change is very real for them, and the consequences are very real for them. So I continue to be encouraged by them. And of course, the momentum that these activists and elected officials built in helping New York pass the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which put us on a great path towards the future, is being matched, not just here in Ithaca, where we've committed to a Green New Deal, which will get us to carbon neutrality by 2030, but in Hallandale Beach, Florida, where the Vice Mayor, Javelina, passed the Securing Florida's Future Act, which included the Hallandale Beach Coral Reef Protection. Spencer Thibodeau in Portland, Maine, or Skippy Mesereau in Aspen, Colorado, making commitments towards renewable energy infrastructure. Kara Rochelle, the state representative in Connecticut, passing a Green Jobs Act at the state level. These folks, whose names you may not yet be familiar with, are the ones who are leading our entire country forward, the ones that give me hope and a blueprint for how we continue to make change, which is encourage activism, listen to those activists, and empower young progressive elected officials to follow up on the demands of our young climate leaders.
Great, thank you. And a particular height there, the youngest of them will be 40 at the times. And so these issues are really going to dramatically affect every one of us here and billions of people across the world if we don't address these issues now. So next I'd love to introduce Chloe Maxim. She's Maine State Senator, and she authored the Green New Deal for Maine.
Everybody, I'm very excited to be here today with all of these incredible people. It's so amazing to see how many young folks are in office these days. My name is Chloe Maxman. For the past 2 years, I've been a state representative here in Maine. And this year, a couple days ago, I was sworn in as a state senator for my hometown. I grew up in a tiny town called Noblesboro. It's about 1,600 people in the middle of Maine. And for as long as I can remember, I have loved Maine and my community more than anything. It's what I devote my life to. When I was little, I really began to see that the biggest threat to Maine, our economy, our culture, our way of life was climate change. So since I was 12, which is about 16 years now, I have devoted most of my existence to confronting the climate crisis in my community. I've done a lot of different stuff in the climate movement. It's been an amazing, long journey. But what I began to realize is that we really need good climate policy, and we don't have good climate policy because we don't have enough good people in office to push that policy forward and get enough votes to get it passed. And 2016 was a really pivotal year for me. I had just graduated from college and I moved back to Noblesboro. I live in a very rural red community. And looking at the 2016 results, I saw two big things. One is that rural America has gone red, very, very red. And the other is that state legislatures are also becoming increasingly red. And it's because of these forces that are anti-climate that is stymieing a lot of the progress that we need on the climate front. So I happen to live in a rural red place, and I happen to live in a conservative House district, District 88, that had never been won by a Democrat before. So in 2018, we set to work to try and really figure out a different kind of progressive politics for rural America that could start to win back some of these seats with the long-term vision of reversing some of these trends and getting better people in office up and down the ballot to pass really substantial climate policy. So we won in 2018. This year we ran again in the state Senate seat, which is also a red seat that was held by a Republican incumbent who was the Senate minority leader. And we're building a new politics for rural America for the express purpose of fighting for climate change. I think it's so important that we're all rooted in our hometowns, doing the work with our people on all possible fronts to make sure that we're fighting for a better future. And that's what makes this world go round. And I learned so much from the people on this call and so many young people in office. And it's really an honor to be here today.
Thank you, Chloe. Next, I'd love to introduce Greta Neubauer. She's a Wisconsin Assembly member, and she's been working on everything from weatherization to helping farmers support sustainable practices up in Wisconsin, which has gotten quite a bit of attention recently.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here. So I remember really clearly the first moment that I understood the urgency of the climate crisis. I was about 19 years old in a big room full of other young people. I think Chloe may have been there. And I was listening to someone talk about the ways that climate change was already changing the world that we live in, how it was impacting all of us now, and particularly those who are already most vulnerable in our communities. I remember sitting there in this big, dark room and really being overcome with fear about what my future would look like, about the world that we were going to inherit. And the only thing that I found that helped assuage that fear was action. And so I joined the youth climate movement and organized with other young people from around the country. As an organizer, I saw the human and environmental impacts of our reliance on fossil fuels, from fracking in Pennsylvania to mountaintop removal coal mining in West Virginia, to the human costs felt by people in my own community, Racine, Wisconsin, where open coal trains regularly pass through low-income residential neighborhoods. These experiences were really motivating to me, and I knew that we needed organizers who were willing to stand up and who were willing to fight back. In 2016, of course, our world really shifted with the election of Donald Trump, and it became clear to me that we not only needed activists outside of Capitol buildings, we needed people inside of them who were continuing those fights. We needed legislators and policymakers who really understood the urgency of the crisis. And we needed people who were committed to creating good jobs, to reducing inequality, and to addressing climate change. So in 2017, I ran for office and I won, and have since then been researching and writing, collaborating with organizers outside the Capitol, drafting bills and policy. We've been pushing for a brighter and better future where our kids don't breathe coal dust while they play outside, where our energy is clean, and all of our neighbors have a good shot at a good life. This work is not easy in states with divided government like Wisconsin, but it is really important. And most importantly, we cannot do it alone, which is why I am here standing with the young elected officials to protect America and calling on the president-elect and Congress to develop a federal climate emergency plan. My community, which is facing eroding shorelines along Lake Michigan, poor air quality, high unemployment, deep racial disparities, severe storms and weather, and now COVID-19, cannot wait any longer for the good jobs that a just transition to 100% clean energy would bring. We can't wait any longer for investments in clean, accessible, affordable transportation. We can't wait any longer for clean drinking water. Despite all of the obstacles, I am hopeful about the next 4 years because I believe that Joe Biden understands what is at stake. But more importantly, I know all of you do. If my experience in office has taught me anything, it's that it's critical that we have people inside the Capitol, but also outside. And I'm grateful to all of those organizers who continue to do the work. We are going to continue showing up, pushing, and supporting this administration to take the action that we need. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, Greta. Next, we'd love to introduce North Carolina Wake County Soil and Water Conservation District Supervisor, Jenna Wadsworth. Jenna, that's a long title, and it deservedly so because she represents actually more people than many state representatives, almost 1.2 million. And a lot of people don't realize the importance of these special districts and the impact they have on our environment and our communities. Jenna has been doing this tirelessly since the early days I was in YEO, and it's been inspiring to see her work, particularly on regenerative agriculture and issues as it relates to climate change, but also how it relates back into the community and homelessness and food insecurity, because all these issues are very connected. So Jenna.
Hey y'all, as we say in the South. My name is Jenna Wadsworth, and I grew up on a hog, cow, chicken, corn, cotton, tobacco, and soybean farm on a dirt road in rural eastern North Carolina. And for the past decade, I've had the ability to serve the 1.2 million people who call Wake County our capital county home as the vice chair of the Soil and Water Conservation District Board of Supervisors. And for the past couple years, at the age of 31, I had the privilege of being the 2020 Democratic nominee for the office of North Carolina Commissioner of Agriculture. Now, I spent the past 2 years working day in and day out to win this seat so that way we could begin to create meaningful change in our agricultural community. And while we did not have the outcome that we had hoped for in this race, I'm still here continuing to fight for all of the issues that were and still are so important to the people who call North Carolina home. Now, my campaign looked at bold solutions to addressing some of society's biggest issues, including climate change, food insecurity, criminal justice reform, and economic freedom. Now, our race was about ushering in new ideas and transformative opportunities and solutions to support our family farmers, to strengthen our rural communities, to protect our environment, and to deliver on our promises to our children. Throughout the campaign, I regularly had people urge me to tone down my rhetoric and suggested that farmers weren't yet ready to talk about climate change, especially since I was running in what was perceived to be a more conservative state. Corporate farms and industry, the industry as a whole, big ag, fought back and spent outrageous sums of money against me because they were afraid of the actions that we would take to combat the climate crisis. But this issue is too important to ever back down from. That's why I refuse to take corporate PAC money, and I signed the No Toxic Money Pledge to signify my commitment not to accept any money from fossil fuel executives or their PACs. I was also the only statewide candidate who signed a pledge in support of the Green New Deal and ushering in good-paying green jobs. Jobs that would not only make our country safer and more sustainable, but would also allow people to put food on the table. I believe in living my values, and I know that we can no longer sit idly by while large corporations denigrate our natural resources and suffer none of the consequences for doing so. So not only advocating for climate action and climate change is something that is morally correct, but it's also beneficial to our economy, to national security, and to the general health and well-being of our citizenry. So without climate action, natural disasters will continue to grow more intense and more frequent in the coming decades. It's naive to think otherwise. Hurricanes have devastated North Carolina in recent years, causing intense flooding that's absolutely destroyed farms and part of our agricultural industry. Hurricane Florence alone killed 5,500 hogs and 3.4 million chickens. The Department of Agriculture has implemented a swine floodplain buyout to provide relief to farmers, but only 43 farms have benefited since the program was created, leaving many without aid and without any hope for any chance at a future doing something that they love to do, which is farm. In fact, according to PBS, over 100 farms that have wanted to participate in the buyout have been turned away, leaving both these farms and their hog operations vulnerable to the effects of future natural disasters. I remember all too well the haunting images of school buses submerged in floodwaters in Lumberton, a largely indigenous community. And while we're all affected by these natural disasters, it is marginalized communities that disproportionately live with the brunt of the effects of climate change and the inaction of current leadership. Addressing this issue will begin to combat environmental racism. Talking about climate change, which has plagued our Black and Indigenous communities and communities of color for far too long, is something we need to do, and we need to continue doing it no matter who is trying to silence us. These folks are more likely to suffer the consequences of pollution and environmental degradation. If we don't take steps to address the climate crisis immediately, We will also continue to see mounting food insecurity across the country, which will again disproportionately affect socioeconomically disadvantaged folks. We now have an opportunity to address the root cause of many of the problems that our farming community faces, with the plans laid out by President-elect Joe Biden at the DNC. And I know that these are our best chances for saving our agricultural industry in both Western North Carolina and across the state as a whole. And while we must hold our elected officials accountable, we must also ensure that their priorities mirror those of the people they are serving. So I call on the Biden administration to follow through with these bold plans to take climate action, not to wait any longer. And this means making meaningful investments in communities on the front lines of the environmental justice movement. It means aiding our farmers in transitioning to more sustainable agricultural practices, including regenerative practices. And it means ensuring that everyone has access to clean and safe drinking water. We can begin by giving our farmers the tools necessary to compete in the global marketplace in the long term. And Biden's plan for rural America addresses low-cost financing for new farm equipment, research and development, and support to develop new income streams. It's not enough to cut farmers a relief check every single time a natural disaster occurs and ravages their land. We must build resiliency into our systems and create jobs that prevent further environmental damage as we go. Everything is interconnected. We have to recognize the reality of the world we're living in, and that means understanding that climate change is an issue we must address now. I only hope that it's not too late. To know this is an issue and look the other way is irresponsible, it is reckless, and it is a dereliction of duty on behalf of our elected officials, corporate leaders, and anyone who has the ability to influence and enact real, meaningful change. Leadership starts at the top. And until we begin to elect leaders who are adamant about addressing climate change, things won't change, things won't get better. We must do everything in our power to fight back against the climate crisis if we want a future that offers hope, prosperity, and good health to the generations that will come after us. And while we weren't victorious in my race, that will not deter me from continuing the fight for climate action alongside the folks like these who are on the call today, because we're fighting for the future, for our children, and for our planet, and I can't imagine a more important fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. So what we'll do now is open the room up to questions. So if you would like to ask a question, just raise your hand digitally, or you can put it in the chat as well, or just simply type the question in the Q&A box. All right, so our first question, as young elected officials, do you mentor other young people who are climate activists?
Sure, I can start.
Please.
So yeah, I've loved mentoring other young people since being in office. The ways that we've primarily done that are through interns and fellowship programs, and then also supporting other electeds or people who are thinking about running who are coming from the climate world. It's, I think, been a really incredible thing to see so many people. As I mentioned, I directly organized, with Chloe when I was a student. There are so many young people who have come to understand that we need, as I said, to be in every space. We need to be everywhere. We need to be advocating on every plane. And so that is a really exciting thing. And frankly, there are more young people coming from climate and all kinds of organizing that want to get involved than we can reasonably support. So there are definitely opportunities for us to grow that work going forward and continue to support people, and definitely glad to support and be here with the elected officials to protect America, and hear the shout out to YEO, two great organizations who are doing that mentorship as well.
Great. I'd like to bring in Michael Moen. If you'd like to ask a question, please.
Yes, and I just typed it out as well, so ignore my typed out question. How do you see issues within the divisions within the Democratic Party, when it comes to issues such as fossil fuels or some differences over whether or not a Green New Deal should be adopted or the size and scope of such a plan. How do you see those divisions potentially impacting any ways of making progress on your coalition's goals?
Sure. I can start, and Jenna, just
Go for it.
like you want to hop in. But you know, I think there is widespread understanding and commitment amongst the Democratic Party, but the public broadly, that we need to take action on this issue. If you look at polls, if you knock on doors, not during a pandemic, but normally, and talk to people, it might not be the first issue that people bring up, but it is something that they care about. And many people have personal stories about the ways that climate change has impacted them or their family members, including here in Wisconsin. You know, I mentioned a couple of the ways that it impacts folks in Racine. So I really do feel very hopeful. I think the presidential election and the conversations that happened amongst primary candidates, for example, demonstrated that we have moved so far in the last even 2 years. You know, climate change was always an afterthought, and that's not the case anymore. It is right up at the top of the list amongst COVID-19 and the economy and so many other things that are pressing. But we understand those issues as connected. We know that we need to take action, and I've seen, you know, here in Wisconsin, a real commitment from every Democratic elected official to support and take action on climate.
Jenna, do you have anything to add?
I'll just add in that, you know, the biggest thing is you have to meet people where they are. You have to find values and commonalities as a way to connect to folks. And I found in particular in rural places in my state, when you talk about climate change, you talk about the Green New Deal, you have to let folks know why this is something that directly impacts them and their livelihood and their long-term economic health and well-being. And when I think about climate change or the Green New Deal, I would talk to apple orchard owners up in Western North Carolina who right now can't get crop insurance anymore because blooming seasons are unpredictable. I would talk to people on the coast, coastal fisher people who didn't know what their next haul was going to look like because of changing storm currents. And, you know, the biggest thing is you have to explain, like, if we don't bring in green jobs, if we don't usher in a Green New Deal, if we don't move to regenerative or organic practices, there won't be a future in agriculture, at least not one that we really recognize. And so this is an absolute necessity. But more than that, I think for a lot of folks, when you directly say, hey, when we say the Green New Deal, what we mean are these types of jobs and investments in your community. This means that you don't have to leave, or your children can come back after college because they know there is a future and there are opportunities for them to be able to plant roots here. And so I think that's the biggest thing. It's just, you know, instead of just saying Green New Deal, because the right perpetually tries to co-opt our language, and sometimes they do a better job with messaging and sound bites than we do. It means actually explaining what these types of investments would look like in people's communities and what that would mean for their future.
Thank you. Michael, do you have any follow-up?
I do have a follow-up question. I'm sorry to take anyone else's time. Real quickly here, do you, in the upper Midwest, in states like Iowa and Wisconsin, we see the agriculture community adopting more conservation practices and whatnot, while also acknowledging, you know, in Iowa, this was a big concern in the caucuses that they wanted presidential candidates to address, was the issue of climate change and how it's impacting farms, you know, with extreme weather events. Do you see that as hope, as gaining more attention, especially those on the right and you know, the conservative movement?
I do. You know, I mentioned, you know, focus primarily in my last response to your question, sort of the broad support that we've seen amongst Democrats for action on climate, but we have seen that from Republicans as well. We had a Republican assembly member serving on the governor's climate change task force. We have a number of Republican legislators who have put forward renewable energy policy. It might not be as urgent in terms of its timeline or its scale as I would like to see, but I really do think that there is a growing understanding that this is impacting everyone. I served last cycle on a number of committees, jobs in the economy, transportation, which we were making decisions and changing state law on with the understanding that weather was changing. Like Jenna just shared, we had farmers coming in saying, our time for harvesting is unpredictable and we need some shifts. And we had milk producers coming in and saying, we're producing at different times. We need some different statutes and when we can drive our trucks on the highways in Wisconsin. We're making decisions in a bipartisan way. We have people coming in every year sharing the impacts of climate change on them. And we're making these decisions to mitigate those impacts, but we have not yet made the commitment to actually address this at the root cause. I'm hoping that that shifts, and I do think that that is shifting given the conversations that I have seen from particularly farmers in the last year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of my friends, Senator Rob Hogue, a tree crushed his house in Iowa, and because of those storms. So the legislators are seeing this firsthand too. In addition, but it's also they're seeing the progress. A third of Iowa's electricity is coming from wind energy. So great. Any other questions, Michael? Okay. Let's move to our next question here. This is for Supervisor Wadsworth. With many small family-owned farms struggling and not currently getting the aid they need, how does asking them to transition to regenerative practices make sense?
So since the start of COVID-19, I've seen numbers that say something like 80% of farmers in the Southern Appalachian region are reporting decreased sales. And if that continues, about 2/3 of them will likely go bankrupt. Farmers are hurting. And this pandemic was just one more layer to further exacerbate some of the stresses that they've been facing for years because of a dereliction of duty on behalf of the current Commissioner of Agriculture and federal agricultural policy in refusing to recognize that climate change is indeed real and an urgent threat to the long-term success and well-being of our farmers throughout this state and throughout this country. There is data that shows that by 2050, temperatures could rise 2 to 5 degrees in North Carolina, and that could be incredibly detrimental to the agricultural industry. As I alluded to earlier, apple orchard owners have already seen issues when it comes to blooming seasons. As our assembly member here mentioned, farmers have seen changing harvest dates. Yields have been affected by these changing dates and just undetermined weather events that could affect them at any moment, especially here in the southeastern United States with hurricanes and flooding. So not adjusting to the reality of climate change, not moving into best management practices that prioritize conservation while allowing our farmers to remain economically viable means that there won't be a future in agriculture. So it is an absolute necessity. It's an economic necessity, in addition to being a moral one, that we help our farmers. We give them every tool necessary in order to transition into regenerative practices or organic practices to move into carbon capture, to help them do everything possible to continue being good stewards of the land, but also continue doing what they love to do, which is farm. And a number of small farmers in Western North Carolina have come to me because they don't know what their future looks like with that potential temperature increase, whether it's our Christmas tree industry or our hops or ginseng or anything else that depends on particularly a colder weather and a colder climate in order for them to be successful. So we have to address this issue now.
Wonderful. So the next question we have is from let's see. People are struggling with the global pandemic that has resulted in lives being upended. Why do you believe this? Climate change is important to focus on now. So, with the pandemic, why is it important to focus on climate change issues with so much happening?
Sure. So I see these issues as all very interconnected. And there are many ways in which that's true. We could talk about challenges with asthma and existing air quality in many of our communities, particularly those inhabited by low-income people and people of color, and increased risk of complications with COVID-19. There are many personal and health implications, but really what I think about is the opportunity that we're presented with. My community, Racine, Wisconsin, has long struggled with unemployment. We've had some of the highest unemployment rates in the state for my entire lifetime. And what we have in front of us right now is an opportunity to actually make investments and change policy to get people good jobs that also address climate change. There are many people in our community whose jobs likely will not return after the pandemic. There are small businesses that are closing. There are particularly restaurants that are closing. We need to do everything we can to help them survive, but we also need to recognize that there are a lot of people who are going to be looking for a next career. And this is a huge opportunity for us to train those folks to create those kind of good jobs that are going to mean a sustainable long-term career for people in our communities and address the impacts of climate change. There are too many benefits to mention to building commuter rail in my part of the state. There are too many benefits to mention to weatherizing low-income homes that will save people money, that will create those good jobs, that will reduce our carbon footprint. I really do see this as a huge opportunity, and I think that consensus is building on both sides of the aisle, and certainly amongst members of the public, where we see widespread support for both investments in mitigating the impacts of climate change and addressing climate change and a COVID-19 recovery, ambitious COVID-19 recovery. So I'm hopeful that we are going to see an increasing amount of support amongst elected officials for what the public is very clearly demanding in this moment, which is action on climate and an economic recovery from COVID-19.
Yeah, absolutely. The actions can't wait. I mean, I was activated by the military to do the planning for the vaccination distribution. And worldwide, diseases are one of the most killers. I mean, we have half the world's hospital beds before the pandemic were occupied by infectious diseases. And so what we're seeing now is if we don't address the issues that lead to future pandemics, now it can become much more common in the future. And that has economic, it has security, it has health implications. So to wait is just inviting future pandemics to happen. All right, so next question here. What are the greatest hurdles to getting young climate champions elected to office? So, and there's a similar question here, also looking at what advice would you give other young people who want to get involved in politics? So maybe we can bring those two questions together. Jenna, do you want to take a first crack at that one?
Well, so for years, I've been a member of the Young Elected Officials Network, as well as an organization called Local Progress, which is housed under the Center for Popular Democracy. I also am the co-founder and the former co-director of New Leaders Council North Carolina, which is part of the larger New Leaders Council organization that works to train, recruit, and mentor the next generation of progressive leaders in our state. And I think that we have to continue doing everything we can to work with organizations that are doing this great work to help folks build power. And, you know, I would also say that for those of us that are elected or running for office, it also means leading by example, continuing to use our voices. I mean, for myself, I was the most unapologetically progressive person running in our state. I was also the youngest person running statewide this year. And as an out LGBTQ woman, young woman, I think that visibility helped other folks to see what was possible in these spaces. And, you know, one of my personal mantras is to be a woman who lifts as she rises. So always to use my platform and position of power and privilege in order to bring along new and diverse voices, marginalized voices who sometimes don't have a seat at the table. So I think that's part of it, is that those of us that are in occupy a position of power absolutely have a responsibility to create space for other voices that need to be heard and often aren't. And so I think that's part of it. And the other thing that, you know, I think all young folks struggle with when it comes to running for office is the financial hurdle of not just raising the money, because sometimes we just don't have the same networks with the same deep pockets that more established candidates do. But also, for a number of these offices, a lot of elected offices aren't paid, or they are not paid at a salary that, you know, is a living wage that allows you to do anything other than working multiple other jobs. And so that's very, very difficult too when we talk about who is even able to take the time off to be able to run for an office. I know that for me, it was a great personal financial endeavor for the last 2 years, working 11 to 22 hours, 7 days a week, running statewide in one of the biggest states in the country. And that makes it very, very hard for a lot of folks to join this movement as elected officials or candidates. And so I think we just need to be mindful of that. We always need to create space for others, and we need to do everything in our power to allow this movement to be more diverse and representative of the actual people who we're representing and who want to serve.
Well stated. The only thing I would add is that join a fellowship at Elected Officials to Protect America, because you'll get to interact with a lot of young elected officials across the U.S. and actually the world too. So I encourage you as a first step into jumping in. Our fellowship program provides the mentorship and the connections, and you'll get to be immersed in this environment for a while. And of course, reach out to any of us anytime. I think that covers our questions here. What we'll do now is transition into a kind of a closing remark. And if each of you could just 1 to 2 minutes encapsulate what the most important reason why we need to act now for Global Youth Climate Action Day.
Jenna, do you want to start? Sure. The urgency is extremely clear. We all know what is at stake, and the fact that we do not have any time to lose. I think sometimes young people don't realize how much power they in fact have. Of course, that includes running for office and being elected, but it also includes showing up. People often think that we are flooded with letters and phone calls in the office, and often that's not the case. If we get 5 or 10 or 15 letters, if we have young people who call and ask us to get on the phone and talk about the issues that they care about, it means a lot. It means a lot to me, and I know that it means a lot to my colleagues. And so I am really grateful to the elected officials to Protect America for organizing us. And I am so grateful to every young person who has been willing to make sacrifices to step up in this moment for their own future and for all of our collective future in this moment, and to use the power that they have to influence their elected officials at each and every level to push and support them to make the commitments that we need in this moment.
Again, my name is Jenna Wadsworth, and I was the 2020 Democratic nominee for North Carolina Commissioner of Agriculture. And I ran for that office against a 16-year entrenched Republican incumbent who is leading our state's biggest economic industry, a $92 billion annual industry in North Carolina, because he doesn't believe that climate change is real. And I know that it is the most pressing problem that will face not just my generation, but for generations to come. It will absolutely decimate the agricultural industry unless we begin to act. And it's naive to think that storms won't grow more intense and more frequent over the coming years. Writing a relief check can't be our only solution to dealing with natural disasters. We must be proactive instead of reactive. We must begin to address climate change and the climate crisis as the urgent threat that it is, not just to agricultural security and food security, but also to national security. This is about protecting our farmers. This is about creating green new jobs that allow our rural communities to be revitalized, allowing them to have a better future with more opportunities that enhance wellness and also long-term success and prosperity. And it also means standing up and fighting for our children who may not be able to yet use their voices to advocate for themselves, but it is absolutely incumbent upon us to stand up and fight for them. And so I just want to encourage every single person, no matter your age, young or old, to realize that you are powerful and that your voice matters and that you can play a meaningful role in shaping the future of this country and our fight against the climate crisis, and that you should not wait any longer to do that, to raise your voices and say that, you know, this next administration must address the climate crisis and must declare the climate crisis as a national emergency and one which we must act swiftly in order to address.
Thank you. And with that, we will conclude our press briefing. Please feel free to reach out if you have any follow-up questions. We will send out the press release momentarily, and then we'll follow up with the video clips and the full recording of this press release, briefing on Global Youth Climate Action Day. So thank you very much, everyone.